press freedom is part of the story now. Whatever concern you might have about it being awkward to talk about your own role as a journalist, it is the story. We're reading about it every day.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored Radio Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, and we're very glad to welcome back to the program Seth Stern, who's the Chief of Advocacy over at Freedom of the Press Foundation. Seth, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
So, Seth, we have a lot to get to today, unfortunately. But I'd like to start with the Prairieland 9 trial, and we're not going to get into all the details because that would be at least a full hour show on its own, but Seth, you've written about this at The Intercept, as has Jeremy Busby, the incarcerated journalist who we've also had on the show. So I recommend folks go check out those articles for a more in-depth look. But I want to start here talking to you about some of the verdicts, which read like a very dystopian novel. One that jurors convicted 8 defendants on material support for terrorism charges for wearing black clothes. Prosecutors claimed that the use of black bloc clothing, which is not a thing, was an Antifa tactic that assisted in the shooting of an officer. Defendants were also convicted of providing material support to terrorists, rioting, and explosives charges related to fireworks. But wait, it gets worse. Zines about anti-fascism, anarchy, and organizing were treated as tools of terrorism rather than protected free speech. So, Seth, can you walk us through some of these remarkably disturbing and extreme verdicts?
Sure. So the only actual crime that may have been committed was that supposedly one of the protesters fired a gun and hit a police officer who was responding to the protest. The officer quickly recovered. I think he was hospitalized for a couple of hours. Subsequently, though, instead of prosecuting the shooter, the authorities decided to prosecute as many people as they possibly could by creating this conspiracy framework. And the advantage to prosecutors of imagining up something like an Antifa is that then you don't actually need to prove a conspiracy to fire the gun at this particular officer, because there was none. It, by all accounts, is something that sort of happened spontaneously, much to the dismay of most of the protesters who were there to attend a protest, make their voices heard, and go home and get on with their lives, not to get caught up in any sort of criminal case. But once you've got this so-called terrorist group, you can string together theories by which even people who had nothing to do with the shooting itself allegedly have to do with the imaginary group, and you can, loop them in that way. So there you, as you said, something like making up a uniform that this group wears and wearing that uniform. I guess I'm wearing that uniform. I'm wearing black. Wearing that uniform makes you a member of the terrorist group if you're with the supposed group at the time that they commit a crime. That's enough. In the case involving the zines, there was a particular person, Daniel Sanchez Estrada, who wasn't even there at the protest. His wife was. He had some anarchist zines in his home that he moved after the protest. I don't know why he moved them. Maybe he did move them because he was afraid after he heard there had been a shooting that cops would use those zines against him. But that's a comment on the lawlessness of the cops and the prosecutors more than anything on Sanchez Estrada's end. All he did was have constitutionally protected literature. And if he was concerned that that would be used against him or his wife in a criminal case, his concerns have now been validated because indeed they were. Now, the zines he had were, for anyone who's ever read a zine, nothing unusual. They're political theory. They're essays. Some interesting, some not. They're just like any other piece of literature you pick up, but not a single one of them had anything to do with a protest in Texas on July 4th let alone shooting a police officer at said protest. They were, years old zines, collections of essays commonly available. Um, but again, by looping everything under this Antifa umbrella, the authorities were able to make the case that his possession of Antifa literature, which apparently zines are, just like black shirts are Antifa uniforms, that evidenced involvement in this organization that was ultimately responsible for the officer being shot. And his moving that literature while knowing that his wife was at this protest and might come under investigation as due to that is concealment of evidence. But the question is, evidence of what? Having zines is not evidence of a crime. Reading the same literature that a criminal reads is not evidence of the crime. So is that where they were going? Well, the shooter also had similar zines. So what? I'm sure a lot of stuff I've read has been read by criminals. Um, I would guess that at some point in time, a criminal watched the Project Censored Show, um, or on YouTube, or listened in their radio.
I hope so.
Am I a conspirator to whatever unknown crimes said people may have committed? I mean, it's so ridiculous. Like you don't even know where to start. And what's really remarkable about it, when you think about it in terms of freedom of the press, is those anarchist zines um, arguably have a lot more in common with the kind of literature that prompted the founders to draft the press freedom clause than, say, the New York Times or Associated Press reporting does. Back then, there was no institutional press. Mostly, people were talking about pamphlets and other political literature that was distributed hand to hand, much like these zines. And given that this was all developed in the context of a revolution, there was no exception made for literature that encouraged radicalism or encouraged revolution. That wouldn't make much sense for a bunch of revolutionaries to say freedom of the press except for revolutionary literature. So this certainly was never the intent of the First Amendment for possession or moving of zines, which, I would assume during the revolution, prior to the revolution, when plotting against the British was likely frowned upon, I bet some of the founders moved some of their pamphlets themselves to evade the authorities. So this is so contrary to everything that American press freedom is supposed to stand for. And you mentioned Jeremy's article. What he added to that is that this has been happening in prisons for the longest. People have been put in solitary, had their sentences enhanced, otherwise been penalized because literature, sort of anti-authoritarian literature that guards worry might incite some sort of rebellion, has been found in their cells. And in order to do that in prisons, and I would argue that it's unconstitutional and downright awful in that setting too, but the argument would be that, well, people who are incarcerated pose these unique risks. They have lessened constitutional rights as opposed to people on the outside. There is a more legitimate fear of imminent lawlessness. Whatever excuses might have been used to justify that on the inside are proven to be just excuses, because now we see, when the opportunity arises, the exact same thing happening on the outside.
Yeah, and I want to get to some more another issue that we've seen happening in prisons. But before I get to that, I want to just ask about the precedent here, because, of course, the First Amendment or any policy or legislation is only as good as its enforcement. Uh, if this sets precedent that overrules and overrides the First Amendment, what good is the First Amendment, and what kind of precedent does this set for somebody who, I don't know, reads?
Right? Yeah. Not a great one. Not a great one. It creates a glaring exception to basic First Amendment freedoms for anything that prosecutors can tie to whatever they consider to be terrorism, whatever they consider to be um, Antifa, which was never is not the standard under which the First Amendment operates. The only sort of violence or lawlessness exceptions to the First Amendment have to do with incitement of imminent violence. Um, there is nothing imminent about reading political theory that hypothetically might radicalize you, hypothetically might cause you to develop anti-government positions that hypothetically might one day lead you to take violent action against the government, which I guess is the domino effect that prosecutors would point to develop a theory like this. Lots of people read anti-government literature. That's the whole point of the First Amendment. We don't need a First Amendment to protect the right to read pro-government literature. The government isn't coming after you for that. They want you to do that. So if there is to be a constitutional right, that presumably was the right to read, write, possess stuff the government doesn't want you to have. So yes, the precedent would be extremely damaging. My strong hope is that it will be overruled on appeal, and both there are plenty of reasons to be somewhat optimistic that'll happen. Both that, even these days, the idea that wearing a shirt or possessing zines can get you imprisoned for terrorism or related charges is absurd. There were also a lot of procedural issues with the case. The judge disqualified counsel for arbitrary reasons on more than one occasion, and did a lot of other very questionable stuff in the course of administering the case. So there are procedural and substantive reasons to overrule this case. I hope that'll happen. But the thing is that the government has said this will not be the last time they attempt this. There are going to be more quote unquote terrorism prosecutions based on constitutionally protected speech. And this wasn't the first one either. This is in many ways reminiscent of the Cop City case in Atlanta. Just that one failed where this one succeeded.
Yeah, absolutely. Contextualizing where we are is super important. And I want to move now because you mentioned Jeremy Busby and incarcerated folks trying to tell the story of their lived reality. And a couple of weeks ago were the Oscars, and although it didn't win, the Alabama Solution was up for Best Documentary, and it's a film made using contraband cell phones. And quoting now from an article that you co-authored in Inquest, quote, "The film exposes overcrowding, violence, medical neglect, and suspicious deaths that the Alabama Department of Corrections worked hard to conceal. It shows guards sleeping while on the clock as incarcerated people overdose and pools of blood left in cells after violent assaults," end quote. According to the advocacy organization Unlock the Box, at least 122,000 people are right now in solitary confinement in the U.S. For their journalism, for their filmmaking. Those folks involved, Raoul Poole, Robert Earl Council, and Melvin Ray, were transferred to extreme solitary confinement at Alabama's Kilby Prison in January. And of course, this retaliation is nothing new. Again, we spoke to Jeremy Busby on this show about it. He's one of the co-authors of this article as well. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the status of these filmmakers as of today. We're recording this on March 19th, so folks know, and what the kind of violent censorship we're seeing in prisons could tell us about the future of our press freedoms on the outside.
Yeah, the last information I got about the filmmakers, and I can't be absolutely certain that it's current, is that one of them was still in solitary. It is possible that one or two of the others are no longer in solitary, but these situations are fluid, and I don't want to speak about that with absolute certainty. The point really is that very likely in retaliation for capturing the footage that formed that allowed for the creation of this Oscar-nominated film exposing abuses, 3 people were placed in solitary confinement, retaliated against, punished. I would note, for another example of people placed in solitary confinement, getting back to the Prairieland case, many of those defendants leading up to trial were placed in solitary confinement. That as well was likely related to the fact that there were terrorism charges against them that allowed the argument to be made, that allowed prison authorities to say, well, these people are a threat, these people are dangerous, they need to be placed in solitary. Didn't matter that the basis for the terrorism charges was black clothing or whatever it may have been. So the solitary confinement is, an enormous problem that is overused and that experts say is akin to, or not akin to, is torture. And rather than being used to protect other incarcerated people, which I suppose is the stated purpose, it is used to retaliate and to break people's spirits and to prevent people from speaking to others, exposing abuses, organizing to combat abuses that are so commonplace in our prison system. One point that article made is that whereas those three individuals were punished for using contraband phones, someone else who recorded abuses illegally, Guan Heng, who was a Chinese whistleblower who obviously broke Chinese law to expose Uyghur internment camps in China, and fled to the United States. He was almost deported recently. He was held by ICE, and his footage had helped BuzzFeed, win Pulitzers for its reporting, similar to how these three folks in Alabama helped produce an Oscar-nominated film. And in Guan Heng's case, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, plenty of other outlets, plenty of other mainstream voices came to his defense. Even Marco Rubio reportedly came to his defense initially. None of these people, none of these voices on the political side or the media side were concerned with the fact that he had broken Chinese law to get the footage he got. Everyone sort of understood that it's an end justifies the means situation, that if you're able to expose abuses or help journalists expose abuses, we can overlook the fact that you recorded the footage contrary to applicable rules. Nobody has the same sympathy for these incarcerated folks, though. They broke the rules too. It wasn't because they wanted to break the rules, not because they were looking for a reason to break the rules. It's because there's no transparency in the prison system, just like there's often no transparency from the Chinese government or from our own government. The only way they could expose what was going on was through the use of contraband cell phones, and so they did. So it's disturbing that we have this double standard. Of course, the other takeaway from the Alabama solution, for me at least, is at what point do journalists on the outside need to get more comfortable with surreptitious news gathering methods? As I said, the reason that the folks in the Alabama solution had to go that route is because all other options were foreclosed. They couldn't get in the front door, so they had to go in the back. They can't just file FOIA requests or ask for interviews with prison staff. That's not how it works. So they found another way. Well, journalists on the outside can't really file FOIA requests or expect to get a meaningful response to FOIA requests when FOIA offices are being depleted and FOIA officers are being fired for complying with FOIA requests. Journalists on the outside can't really expect to get answers from personnel when they're being barred from press conferences, told that soliciting information from non-authorized personnel might be a crime. That's the official position of the Pentagon, pursuant to a brief filed last week in defense of Pete Hegseth's press pledge policies. That's the Pentagon said in the New York Times lawsuit over Pete Hegseth's policy that in order to cover the Pentagon, you need to sign a pledge saying you are not going to publish information you're not authorized to publish. They said it is not criminal solicitation if you ask personnel, PR flacks who are authorized to release it, questions. But if you ask unauthorized people questions, that's criminal solicitation. That's the official position of the federal government. So when you're going against that kind of censorship, maybe you do need to take a page out of the journalist from the Alabama Solutions book and try some other methods that in another time might have been frowned upon. We're going to see whether journalists have the courage to do that, one, and the institutional support to do that, and fight the legal battles that follow, two. That we'll see where that goes.
Yeah, I mean, if journalism is a crime, do you stop doing journalism or do you become a criminal? And I want to get into another piece from an FPF newsletter that recently you sent out. The public deserves to know when war reporting is stifled, and in it you note that journalists covering the U.S. and Israel's war on Iran should be telling their audiences not only what they know, but what they were prevented from finding out and by whom. And you just mentioned, of course, Hegseth's little oath thing, proving their loyalty to Trump and co. Um, and basically this really gets to kind of the core of corporate media, right? I mean, I recall years ago, like over a decade, there was a roundtable discussion on some corporate media outlet that said, when should we strike Syria? Not if, because the if was already a foregone conclusion, right? It was just like the question of when. And this was considered the whole entire spectrum of debate, right? And so I wondered if you could get into this a little bit and kind of, we're kind of getting into like the old Rumsfeld's word salad of the known unknowns, the unknown knowns. But like we don't know what we don't know. And in this case, the lack of knowledge could literally be apocalyptic. And the journalistic malpractice that's supporting this is in these times perhaps the most grotesque. And I was wondering if you could get into a little bit of this and the state of corporate media that's keeping this kind of information from us.
Right, right. Well, the point that I was attempting to make in that article is that oftentimes, when gathering a story, corporate media or otherwise, reporters are prevented from getting the full story in any number of ways. It could be the government, it could be Pete Hegseth, it could be their editors or their corporate parents, whatever conglomerate they're operating under. It could be threats. It could be denials of public records requests. It could be any number of things. And what the news consumer, the reader, viewer ultimately gets is the news that the reporter was able to obtain, but without that context, without the context that this might be a way bigger story. I tried to find out if this was a way bigger story, but I was thwarted from doing so in the following ways. Journalists don't want to publish that for a number of reasons. Word counts, sure. But beyond that, people don't want to admit their failings. People don't want to admit that they weren't able to get the story they wanted, and that their deadline came along, and this is all they got. And also, oftentimes, all they got might seem in and of itself to be a notable story. So why not take the credit for getting a notable story, without beating up on yourself for what you weren't able to get? So there are a lot of different contributors, I think. Also, there's sort of this assumption that the public isn't really interested in the ins and outs of the news gathering process. That's inside baseball. That's navel gazing. You're going to bore people if you include that. Um, I think it's time to reevaluate that mentality. Press freedom is part of the story now. You can't, whatever concern you might have about it being awkward to talk about your own role as a journalist, it is the story. We're reading about it every day. It's subject to attacks from the government on an ongoing basis of increasing creativity and absurdity. So you can't avoid writing about it. My suggestion is, in addition to writing about it as a separate news story when Pete Hegseth announces his new policy, or as an editorial, from or an op-ed, integrate it into the main narrative as you report. Talk about the FOIAs that were denied. Talk about what you were excluded by the Israeli censor from seeing, um, as part of the primary story. Don't put it in a box that only those interested are going to find. You got to make clear that whatever information people are getting about this war is highly censored, and that you're giving them what you're able to give them, but that there's way more to the story. People deserve to know that, and I don't think it's going to reflect poorly on the journalists who are transparent about it. In fact, I think it'll earn them respect from their readers. So that especially with the level of censorship we're seeing now, needs to be part of the process. I don't. When you talk about corporate media, I don't expect that CNN's going to start doing that, but I would like to see more independent journalists do that. The state of corporate media, of course, is the Ellisons are gobbling up more and more of it, and lost in the discourse about how much worse they're going to make it is, how bad it often already is, but it can get a lot worse. And our uh, criticizing what the Ellisons are going to do to CNN's war reporting is almost difficult to do when you lived through the Iraq War and saw what they did with no Ellisons at the table. But it can and will get a lot worse. And I hope people aren't sort of letting their cynicism about the past state of the corporate media get in the way of raising the alarm on what can happen next.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, things can get worse, and somehow they do. And I think you also point out in this piece that it's worth highlighting the risks that journalists take as well, like the Espionage Act, how frequently in the past couple of decades that's been thrown around, and understanding that self-censorship is rampant. And so journalists being honest, not just about what they couldn't get, but the risks they're taking, I think is also important, because it highlights how important real journalism is, and how subversive it is in times like these. Um, and so wrapping up here, I want to get to a story that I just feel like more and more headlines these days are like The Onion, and I don't actually know how The Onion survives as satire, but Florida. You recently wrote about Florida House Bill 945, a proposed bill that would essentially create a Florida state CIA, an operational intelligence office charged with identifying and disrupting threats to Florida and the United States. Now, I kind of feel like that's redundant, because I feel like we already have a lot of people, I'm going to say too many people, running around after perceived threats to the US. So, Seth, what is behind this argument? And what are we looking at in terms of targeting through really vague language and roided up powers if this were to go through?
Yeah, exactly. It's thought policing, and it's spreading across the country, particularly the South. We see it in the Prairieland case, the Cop City case, and now we're seeing it in what Florida is trying to do, because not only are they looking to create their own CIA, but they are putting it within the purview of that state CIA to police domestic terrorism, and ideologies that they consider to be akin to domestic terrorism, viewpoints, opinions that they consider to be akin to domestic terrorism, which could mean Antifa. It could be more ways to attack um, Muslim folks based on, loose concepts of Sharia law, which was sort of the bogeyman that people used to wave around before they came up with the Antifa thing, and some still do. So there are any number of ways that laws like those Florida is attempting to pass can be weaponized, and of course, the reforms to domestic surveillance at the federal level that followed the Church Committee, FISA, and whatnot, as ineffective in some ways as they may have been, and as Edward Snowden and others since exposed, at least they exist at the federal level. They don't exist at the state level. Nobody at the time of the Church Committee ever imagined that Florida would come try to create its own state counterintelligence agency to police thought. So the powers exercised by the state could potentially be greater. Even, and I rarely try to think of things from the perspective of a counterterrorism agent, because that's not who I am. But as the article you're referring to explained, the consensus in that community was that information siloing was problematic. That there were all these agencies that weren't talking to each other, that had bits and pieces of the story of, say, 9/11, and had they been communicating, they would have been able to do something about it. So why are we creating state silos then. It doesn't even make sense from that perspective. Prior to this, if the police in Tampa, Florida got some sort of tip about an actual non-ideology related terrorist operation, presumably they would have called the appropriate federal authorities, shared that tip, and then the information would be in one place. Now they're just going to kind of keep it, I guess. And that doesn't seem like a very effective means of fighting terrorism, even if you were to assume that that was the goal of this, which I don't assume. I assume the goal is thought policing. Florida, of course, governed by Ron DeSantis and a lot of equally extreme folks in the state legislature. There's no reason to give anyone the benefit of the doubt on their intentions with a bill like this one.
No, I mean, just look at the track record. I can't say that any kind of freedom of expression or identity is welcome. So, Seth, thank you so much for walking us through this this cesspool of attacks on freedom of expression, freedom of the press. Folks, do check out the work that FPF, Freedom of the Press Foundation, does. It's really important, particularly in these times. So, Seth, thank you so much for coming back on the show, and thanks for the work that you do.
Thanks. Anytime.